Resident Evil, a series most gamers associate with survival horror, a series which has spanned several decades at this point, a series which has had its ups and downs over the years. There are naturally some great games, some amazing games, and some downright awful games throughout the years. There's probably no argument when people say Operation Raccoon City or Umbrella Corps are the worst in the entire series, and that is with good reason. At the time of writing this video, there have been over 50 releases of Resident Evil, with Resident Evil 4 being the most released title in the series, and with so many releases, the best game is always up for debate. But if you were to ask me what is the best in the series, the answer is going to be Resident Evil 6. So I know what you're thinking, and you've probably already penned your comment to tell me I'm wrong, and you're already hovering over that dislike button, waiting to strike, but hear me out here. I actually have good reasons to back up these wild accusations. There is absolutely no denying that games like Resident Evil 2 Remake, 7, and Village are some of the most well-loved games in the franchise, and at the risk of looking like a fool, Resident Evil 4 Remake as well. There's good reason for this, and the reason is Resident Evil 6. We all know that Resident Evil 6 didn't know what it wanted to be, and we all know how well it reviewed. With 4 completely separate campaigns, different stories, different characters, different genre focus, it was confused, let alone those who even tried to play it. But when I tell you it's the best in the franchise, it's absolutely not for the reasons you initially thought. So, hold fire on that comment telling me I'm wrong, or even that the logo is that dumb it looks like a giraffe getting, and unclick that dislike button, at least just for now. Most people believe that 6 is the worst mainline title in the series, and to fully understand the reasons why, we have to take a trip back in time. Several years before development, in fact. After the first 3 Resident Evil games and Code Veronica, the series was cemented in time as being iconic and loved by fans all over the world, and then we got Resident Evil 4. Bit more action focused, but still retained some of the survival horror elements. It really was a pivotal point in the series, and with Capcom relying on gamers to tell them what the people wanted, they doubled down on action, and we got the boulder-punching Chris Redfield starring in Resident Evil 5. The best-selling game in the franchise, actually. Naturally, you'd expect the follow-up to one of the best games of the decade to sell well, and it did. The problem was that this was very misleading to Capcom. They were losing the hardcore survival horror fans. Capcom saw the success of Resident Evil 5 as the people wanting more action in their Resident Evil games, but they also heard whispers that the fans wanted survival horror still. So, when Resident Evil 6 came out, they doubled down hard on the action, and it bombed. The ironic thing is that 6 is the second best-selling game in the franchise. Why? Because people were promised everything they wanted from Resident Evil, but Capcom delivered none of the promises. Since Resident Evil 6, none of the mainline games have had a focus on action. Sure, there's a bit here and there, but the outright goofy behaviour of some of the characters was toned down significantly. And yes, I know Resident Evil has always been a bit wild, goofy, quirky, and that's what makes it iconic in some ways. But too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. So I've been blabbering on now for around 4 minutes on how the series turned. So how exactly is Resident Evil 6 the best in the series? If it's not obvious by now, then let me drop a massive nuke here. The commercial failure of Resident Evil 6 slapped Capcom right in the face, and it paved the way for change in Resident Evil. Without Resident Evil 6, we wouldn't have the games we have now, the great games we have now, the fantastic games we have now. You see, Resident Evil 6 was so bad, they knew they had to change and go back to their roots, and that became first apparent in Revelations 2. The big change and turnaround in the series was Resident Evil 7, and despite the change in perspective going from third person to first person, it was critically acclaimed and it restored so much faith in Capcom and the Resident Evil franchise. And then came Resident Evil 2 Remake, and by now, the series was well and truly back on form. Sure, I know Resident Evil 3 Remake could have been better, but it really was still fun to play, and it looked amazing. There's no denying that. It's probably worth noting that I don't actually think Resident Evil 6 was a bad game. I actually quite enjoyed it for what it was. If it had been released as a new IP from Capcom, I think it probably would have reviewed better. It was the fact that they labelled it as a mainline Resident Evil game that irked fans, because it just didn't know what it wanted to be. And that's what makes the whole situation from Capcom stranger. They knew that Resident Evil 6 was a financial success. That's right, financially, Resident Evil 6 made a ton of money. So they really took a risk in relying on their fans' feedback and doing something completely different. Fortunately for Capcom, it actually paid off for them in a huge, huge way, and I'm guessing now they're probably very thankful for the risk they took. If we go back to the original statement, then yes, I believe Resident Evil 6 is the best in the series. Not because it was fun, it was great to play, or anything like that. It's because it paved the way for change in the Resident Evil series, and we really wouldn't have some of the fantastic Resident Evil games that we have today if it wasn't for Resident Evil 6. Is it the best to play? No, not by a long shot. Is it the most fun and most addictive game in the entire franchise? No, not at all. If you want some of the best games in Resident Evil to play, to actually enjoy, and get enthralled in, then you've got to be looking at things like Resident Evil 4, the remakes that get made, Village, 7, they're really, really great. Resident Evil 6 isn't even in the top half of the Resident Evil games if you rank them all. It's definitely not the worst, but we owe Resident Evil 6 a hell of a lot more than what you realise, especially if you are a fan of any of the Resident Evil games after 2015. What are your thoughts on Resident Evil 6? I'm guessing in the comments most people are going to say it's trash, it was awful, and you know what? I don't really have an argument against those who think Resident Evil was a bad game, because to play it, it wasn't the best, let's be honest. I still stand by my judgment that Resident Evil 6 is the best game in the franchise, not because it's a great game, but because it changed the course of Resident Evil for us fans forever. Thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to see more just like this.